Israel will not recognize the validity of this decision.
The charges are completely invalid, in my opinion, and the ICC has totally contorted its own charter to seize bogus jurisdiction over Israel. So the countries, the member states of the ICC should not be talking about, like Canada and the UK have, talking about arresting Netanyahu. They should reject these arrest warrants, which are false and have no validity. They're illegal arrest warrants.
Israel is the first line of defense for Western civilization, on the front lines, in the belly of the beast, fighting our shared enemies. You'd think that Western leaders would appreciate that fact and have Israel's back, especially when a global kangaroo court makes false accusations against the world's one and only Jewish state. And yet, the majority of Western leaders, including Canada's Justin Trudeau, who we just showed you, have sold Israel down the river in the wake of arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court last week against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. According to the ICC, the two are guilty of crimes against humanity for conducting Israel's war against Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Here was Bibi's response.
The decision to issue an arrest warrant against me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and our former Defense Minister, was made by a rogue prosecutor who's trying to extricate himself from sexual harassment charges, and by biased judges who are motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments against the one and only Jewish state. Israel will not recognize the validity of this decision. We will continue to do everything we must do to defend our citizens and defend our state against Iran's axis of terror, Iran and its terrorist proxies, which include Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. Our enemies are your enemies, and our victory will be your victory, the victory of civilization over barbarism and tyranny.
Folks, two things. Number one, these are clearly bogus charges. And number two, thank God the United States and Israel are not members of the International Criminal Court and have no obligation to comply with it. But 124 other nations are members, and while the United States thankfully condemned the ICC's anti-Semitic witch hunt, other Western nations seem all too willing to comply. Joining us now to break it down is our good friend, Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of all British forces in Afghanistan and one of the world's foremost defenders of the Jewish state. Colonel Kemp, always great to see you. And you've been sounding the alarm the past few days about these charges levied by the ICC. Give us a bit of background first, Colonel Kemp, about what exactly the ICC is. I think a lot of Americans watching this right now may be saying, what jurisdiction does this court have? Could Bibi get arrested if he leaves the country? What's your view of it?
Yeah, the ICC was set up effectively as a permanent successor to the Nuremberg tribunals, and it was intended to deal with war criminals from countries around the world who'd signed up to the International Criminal Court if these countries themselves could not actually they didn't have the political will or the legal infrastructure to deal with their own criminals. And that's the sole reason they exist. The ICC should not be attempting to prosecute somebody from a country that does have the capability and the track record of dealing with this kind of offense itself. And Israel does have that track record. Yeah. But when it comes to arrest warrants, every country that's a member of the ICC, and as you mentioned, 124 different countries are signed up to it around the world, they have an obligation to arrest the individuals that are charged or have arrest warrants awarded to them if they enter their country. They don't have any other mechanism for actually seizing an individual. But they do have an obligation, each of these countries does have an obligation to satisfy itself that the charges being brought have some validity and that the ICC actually has jurisdiction. Neither of those two things apply.
Yeah. Colonel Kemp, can you imagine? I mean, the democratically elected leader of a democratic nation, the nation of Israel, say, coming to the UK or Canada and being placed in cuffs after this ICC jurisdiction, or this ICC ruling, I should say, these charges levied. Hey, we'll bring you right back after the break, of course, but real quick, about a minute left. You've been on the ground with the IDF many, many times over the years, in particular since October 7th. This is the most humane fighting force in the world, it seems to me, the IDF. What's your firsthand expert take on that?
Yeah, the IDF has taken every possible measure, and more than any other country, to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians, while Hamas, which the IDF has no choice but to deal with, Hamas do their best to maximize the number of civilians that are killed inside Gaza, their own civilians. And the other major allegation against Prime Minister Netanyahu is that he's guilty of starvation of the population. They couldn't be more wrong. No other army in history has ever gone to the extent that Israel has to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza in an area that they're actually at the same time fighting a war inside. I've witnessed the fighting, I've witnessed the humanitarian aid delivery. Both of those two things mean that, again, these charges, not only is the jurisdiction completely out of line, but the charges have absolutely no substance.
What's your assessment right now? It seems that Israel has made very great headway in smashing Hamas and Hezbollah. What is your assessment of the state of play there? Are things winding down, in a sense, in Gaza and in Lebanon, or is there much more work to be done there by the IDF?
Well, the IDF has largely destroyed Hamas's organized fighting capability over the last year. They have no formed military elements remaining. There's still remnants of Hamas. They're operating as low-level, small-scale guerrilla groups, still capable of lethal action against their own people and against the IDF. But the IDF is working very hard now to mop up the remnants of Hamas. It might take many more months before they're able to do it, because Hamas has been so well dug into Gaza. And let's not forget the hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath Gaza, which have got to be, first of all, located, and most of them have been, but then destroyed, which is a lengthy process. And then, of course, the IDF and the government of Israel have to figure out how Gaza is going to be governed in the period after Hamas have been defeated. So there's a lot of work still to be done there, unfortunately. Further north in Lebanon, the IDF have been incredibly successful against Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy like Hamas. Of course, Iran's hand is behind this whole seven-front war. But the Israelis have been phenomenally successful. We just have to think about their decapitation of Hezbollah, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, the masterful operation using explosive-laden pagers and radios to kill many of their top leaders as well, plus taking out vast quantities of their infrastructure, including their rocket systems. So you now have Hezbollah, which was the most powerful terrorist organization the world's ever known, is now reduced to, I think, a shadow of its former self. It launched something like 350 missiles into Israel in the last day or so. So it's not finished, but it's certainly nothing like the organization it was. And Israel does need to keep hammering away at Hezbollah, despite the talk of ceasefire that we hear, which I think would be a mistake to ceasefire now. It might happen. There might be political reasons for doing that, but militarily, I think the Israelis need to keep bashing Hezbollah. And let's not forget also, Hezbollah is losing a lot of credibility across the Middle East, and particularly inside Lebanon itself, where there's much more dissent against Hezbollah than we've seen for a very, very long time.
Colonel Kemp, great breakdown as always. Hey, you mentioned Iran, the head of the snake, the Iranian regime. What effect do you think the Trump effect, Donald Trump taking office once again come January 20th, will have vis-a-vis Iran and its march across the region? Iran seems to be on notice right now with Trump coming back, and with Israel, as you just laid out, dealing heavy blows to that ring of fire led by Hamas and Hezbollah.
Well, I think the Biden administration has held back Israel in many different ways. I think the war that's going on now in Gaza and Lebanon and on the other fronts would have probably been over by now if Biden hadn't been working so hard to try and restrain Israel, and at the same time, and probably because of his determination to appease Iran. And he's released billions of dollars worth of frozen assets back to Iran to enable them to carry out their aggression. He's been seeking a nuclear deal. My hope and my expectation is that when President Trump comes into the White House, Israel will have its hands freed to deal with, more effectively to deal with its enemies, most notably Iran. Iran has got to be dealt with decisively by Israel. Israel has the capability of doing that. Iran's on the cusp of gaining nuclear weapons. That can't be allowed to happen. It would not just threaten Israel, it would threaten the whole of the Middle East and the world. Therefore, Israel has to be enabled and allowed to act decisively against it. I hope that President Trump will be the man who steps up to this and, even if the US doesn't get directly involved, at least facilitates Israel's decisive destruction of the regime in Iran, which cannot be allowed to continue down its current route.
Welcome back to Stakelbeck Tonight. We told you earlier about those pro-Hamas riots that went down in Montreal on Friday night. We've seen similar madness, of course, here in the United States on college campuses in recent months. But is that about to change once President Trump takes office in January? Here to break it down is Brooke Goldstein, human rights attorney, activist, and founder and executive director of the Lawfare Project. Brooke, always great to see you. What do you think? You've done such great work, Brooke, documenting this, including recently a hate crime at DePaul University in Chicago. Is the Trump effect going to have a major effect on college campuses with this pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic madness?
Eric, it's so great to be back here. Thank you for having me and for focusing on the really important issue of rising Jew hatred. I'm so happy that in your introduction, you called these protests what they are. They are pro-Hamas protests. They're not pro-Israel, they're not anti-Israel protests. They have nothing to do with establishing a Palestinian state and everything to do with bringing radicalization and pro-terror support to our campuses. So the question is, will we see something different in the Trump administration? And my answer to that is, well, I certainly hope so, because throughout history, right, we've had ebbs and flows of anti-Semitism. And the one thing that keeps Jew hatred down, and obviously Jew hatred eventually morphs, and we're seeing it right now, into violence, and not just violence against Jews, but the degradation of an entire society. And the one thing that keeps it at bay is consequences, the rule of law, and enforcement of the rule of law. And I believe that President Trump has said many times that he intends to enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, that he intends to cut off federal funding from schools that are operating in violation of the law. And I know that attorneys at the Lawfare Project are working extraordinarily hard to ensure that the civil rights of Jewish students and professors on campuses are protected. And if we are able to bring back the rule of law to this country, to root out the elements that are pro-terror and are shown to have links between designated terrorist groups, and if the government works to protect the Jewish community like every other minority community is deserved of protection in this country, then I do believe that we have a very bright future. And this is an incredible country. I am grateful to be American, and I know that when we apply civil rights law, we will be able to root out the oldest hatred in the books, which is Jew hatred.
Yeah, Brooke, you and your team at the Lawfare Project are doing such great work on this issue, and you've been highlighting the nefarious role of Qatar. How important is it to hold this nation accountable for the anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas madness on American college campuses?
Well, there have been a lot of incredible groups that have published research, including ISCAP, showing the over $1 billion a year of foreign funding, especially coming from Qatar, the #2 state sponsor of terrorism, the #1 state sponsor of the Hamas terrorist group, coming into our country and funding not just college campuses, but also K through 12 education. And there is no doubt a direct link between the foreign funding coming to our campuses and the 300% rise in anti-Semitic Jew hatred and an anti-Americanism on the campuses that they're funding. I think any foreign funding going towards education in this country has to be re-examined, whether it's from China, whether it's from Qatar, whether it's from Russia, and it's coming, frankly, from all three sources. Yeah. And we need the Office of Civil Rights to do its job and make sure that the politics and hatred and indoctrination towards radicalization is wiped out of our curriculum, because we're talking about the future of what the American society is going to look like. Are we going to be capitalist? Are we going to be pro-democracy? Are we going to have the same ideals enshrined in the Constitution that our founding fathers had? Or is this country going to look dramatically different within the next 5 to 10 years if we continue this type of radicalized education?
Yeah, thankfully, we have a new sheriff in town come January 20th and Donald Trump. Canada, your native country, Brooke, of course, you're an American now, you live here now, but you were born in Canada. And Justin Trudeau is a quite different story. Number one, we saw these pro-Hamas mobs take to the streets of Montreal Friday night. But number two, late last week, Justin Trudeau said he would essentially arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he came to Canada. He would adhere to this International Criminal Court ruling. This is Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. About a minute left. What's your take on this?
I think that the reasoning is flawed. Basically, to break it down in its simplest form, you have the only democracy in the Middle East fighting on the front lines of the war against extremist Islamist terrorism. And now other democracies for which Israel is fighting are trying to hamper the abilities of Israel to fight and defeat Islamist terrorism right at its borders. This type of flawed, politicized lawfare will no doubt come to bite other democracies, because once you accuse Israel, which is engaged in a battle for self-defense, which has gone above and beyond what the laws of armed conflict even require, of somehow violating international law and its self-defense maneuvers, those same principles and precedents at law will be held against other democracies. It is strategically flawed. It is politicized lawfare at its worst, and frankly, it's a danger to the stabilization of the world and to the credibility of the international legal system.
Stakelbeck Tonight, my all-new nightly series on current events through a bold biblical lens. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an upload, and tap the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video is posted. And don't forget to share your thoughts, insights, and comments below. Thanks for watching, and God bless.